My parents did not let me live, so I ran away from them. I found myself a girlfriend, but she wanted to reconcile us and secretly invited them to my house. Growing up, I always knew my family was different, but not in a good way. My parents, especially my mom, seemed to have this endless need to control every aspect of my life. My dad, while less vocal, was just as complicit. Together, they created an environment so stifling that I can still feel its weight pressing down on me, even now. My name is Jason, and this is the story of how I finally broke free from the chains of a toxic family. It's not something I talk about often, partly because of the shame and partly because of the lingering fear that somehow they'll find a way to pull me back in. But for the sake of my sanity, and maybe someone out there who can relate, here it is. From as far back as I can remember, my mother had this way of turning every situation into a crisis. I swear she thrived on drama. If I forgot to clean my room before dinner, it wasn't just a mistake. It was proof that I didn't respect her, that I was a failure as a son. And my dad? He would stand in the corner with this stone-cold face, as if he was silently agreeing with everything she said. Looking back, I don't know what was worse, her constant yelling or his deafening silence. One of the earliest memories I have is from when I was about 7 years old. I'd brought home a drawing I made at school, a simple crayon sketch of a house with a sun and a stick figure family. I was so proud of it. I remember running into the kitchen, holding it up for my mom to see. She glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds before saying, "Is that the best you can do? Your cousin Emma draws so much better than this." It crushed me. I'd worked so hard on that drawing, and in an instant, she managed to turn my pride into shame. That's how it always was with her. No matter what I did, it was never good enough. By the time I was a teenager, I'd learned to keep my head down and avoid unnecessary conflict. But that didn't stop them from finding reasons to criticize me. When I got my first B+ in 9th grade, my mom acted like it was the end of the world. "Do you think colleges accept mediocrity?" she'd said, her voice dripping with disdain. My dad just nodded along, as if her words were gospel. It wasn't just academics, though. They wanted control over every part of my life, who I was friends with, what hobbies I pursued, even how I dressed. Once, when I was 15, I bought a pair of jeans with my own money. My mom found them and threw a fit because they were too tight and made me look disrespectful. She marched me back to the store and forced me to return them. I remember standing there, red-faced and humiliated, while the cashier processed the return. As I got older, the fights became more intense. They'd pick at every decision I made, no matter how small. When I was 18 and told them I wanted to study graphic design, my mom flipped out. "You'll never make any money doing that," she said. "Do you want to end up a failure?" My dad, of course, agreed. They pushed me to study business instead, and in the end, I gave in. I didn't have the energy to fight them anymore. College was supposed to be my escape, but even then, they managed to keep their claws in me. They called me every day, sometimes multiple times, demanding updates on my grades, my friends, and even my diet. If I didn't answer, they'd leave these passive-aggressive voicemails about how ungrateful I was. I started to dread the sound of my phone ringing. Things came to a head when I turned 30. By that point, I'd moved out and had a decent job as a marketing coordinator. I was trying to build a life for myself, but my parents still treated me like I was 12. They'd show up unannounced at my apartment, rifle through my stuff, and criticize everything from the furniture I chose to the food in my fridge. The final straw came during a family gathering. It was my mom's birthday, and I decided to suck it up and attend for the sake of keeping the peace. But as soon as I walked through the door, she started in on me. "Why don't you have a girlfriend yet?" she asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Are you planning to be single forever?" I tried to laugh it off, but she wouldn't let it go. For the next hour, she kept making digs at me, about my weight, my job, even the way I styled my hair. My dad sat there, as usual, saying nothing. At one point, she made a comment about how I'd probably end up alone and living with cats. Everyone laughed, but I felt like I was going to explode. After the party, I confronted her. I told her how her constant criticism made me feel, how it had been eating away at me for years. She looked at me like I'd just slapped her. "You're being so dramatic," she said. "I'm your mother. Everything I do is for your own good." That was it for me. I couldn't do it anymore. I realized that no matter what I said or did, they were never going to change. They didn't see me as an adult with my own thoughts and feelings. They saw me as an extension of themselves, someone they could control and manipulate. A week later, I made the hardest decision of my life. I cut them off completely. I blocked their numbers, stopped answering their emails, and told my friends not to give them any information about me. It wasn't easy. For weeks, I felt like a horrible person. I kept questioning whether I'd done the right thing. But over time, I started to feel a sense of freedom that I'd never known before. Cutting ties with my parents wasn't just about escaping their toxicity. It was about reclaiming my life. It was about learning to set boundaries and prioritize my own well-being. And while it hasn't been a smooth journey, it's one I don't regret. I never thought planning a wedding could bring out so much tension, but then again, my life has never been simple. Sarah and I were engaged for about 6 months when we finally sat down to hash out the details. We'd agreed on a $60,000 budget, which was enough to give us the beautiful celebration we both wanted. At least, that's what I thought. What I didn't expect was how quickly everything would spiral out of control. Sarah and I had always been good at communicating, or so I believed. She was compassionate, smart, and had a way of making me feel like I could trust her with anything. But when we started discussing the guest list, things took a turn. She casually brought up the idea of inviting my parents. I froze, trying to process what she just said. "You're kidding, right?" I asked, half laughing, hoping she was joking. She wasn't. "Jason, I know things are complicated with them," she began, her tone gentle but firm. "But it's been over 5 years. Don't you think this could be an opportunity to mend things?" Mend things? My parents didn't just hurt me. They'd systematically torn me down for 3 decades. The idea of seeing them again, let alone at my wedding, made my stomach churn. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Sarah, I cut them out for a reason. You know that. I can't have them there." She looked at me with those big, empathetic eyes of hers, and for a moment, I thought she might understand. But instead, she said something that left me completely blindsided. "Jason, I think you're being too harsh. They're your family. I can't imagine not having my parents at my wedding." The thing is, Sarah's parents were the complete opposite of mine. Her mom, Linda, was warm and supportive, always offering unsolicited but well-meaning advice about our future. Her dad, Robert, was the type of guy who could fix anything and had a knack for making people laugh. They adored me, and I genuinely liked them. But Sarah's idealized view of family made it impossible for her to grasp the toxic dynamic I grew up with. We went back and forth for hours that night. I explained, in painful detail, why I couldn't have my parents there. I told her about the manipulation, the constant criticism, and the years it took for me to rebuild my self-esteem after cutting them off. She listened, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. A week later, the topic came up again, this time during a meeting with our wedding planner, a sharp-tongued woman named Amanda who had a no-nonsense approach to everything. We were discussing seating arrangements when Sarah casually said, "We'll need to reserve 2 spots for Jason's parents." I shot her a look, my jaw tightening. Amanda noticed the tension immediately. "Are they confirmed guests?" Amanda asked, her pen poised over the seating chart. "They're not coming," I said firmly. Sarah sighed. "We're still discussing it." I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but I didn't want to cause a scene in front of Amanda. Instead, I clenched my fists under the table and stayed silent. The rest of the meeting was a blur. All I could think about was how betrayed I felt. That night, I confronted Sarah. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded. "You're supposed to be on my side." "I am on your side," she insisted. "But Jason, this isn't just about you. This is our wedding. Don't you think it's worth trying to make peace with them, even if it's just for one day?" Her words stung. It felt like she was minimizing everything I'd been through. I reminded her, once again, of the years of emotional abuse, the countless times my parents had made me feel worthless. But no matter what I said, she kept coming back to the same point. Family is family. As the weeks went on, the arguments became more frequent and more heated. One night, things reached a boiling point. We were sitting in the living room, going over the budget, when Sarah brought up the idea of cutting costs on the catering to accommodate the extra guests. Are you seriously suggesting we downgrade the food so my parents can come? I snapped. It's not about the food, Jason. It's about doing the right thing, she shot back. The right thing for who? For them? What about me? Don't I deserve to feel safe at my own wedding? Her face softened for a moment, and I thought I might have gotten through to her. But then she said something that made my blood run cold. Jason, I think you're being selfish. Selfish. That word hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, struggling to find the right words. How could she not see that this wasn't about selfishness? It was about survival. The next day, I confided in my best friend, Ethan. He'd known me since college and was one of the few people who truly understood the depth of my issues with my parents. We met at a coffee shop, and as soon as I sat down, the frustration spilled out of me. She wants to invite them, I said, shaking my head. She thinks the wedding is some magical cure-all for years of trauma. Ethan raised an eyebrow. She actually said that? Not in those exact words, but yeah, that's basically what she's implying. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Look, man, I'm not saying you should call off the wedding, but this is a pretty big red flag. If she can't respect your boundaries now, what's that going to mean for your marriage? His words stuck with me. I loved Sarah, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. Was this just a difference of opinion? Or was it a sign of deeper incompatibilities? Things took an even darker turn when Sarah decided to go behind my back. I found out through a mutual friend, Emily, that Sarah had reached out to my parents. She'd apparently sent them an email, inviting them to the wedding and explaining how she hoped it could be a chance for reconciliation. When Emily told me, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I confronted Sarah that night, furious and hurt. How could you do this without telling me? I demanded. I was just trying to help, she said, tears streaming down her face. I thought if they heard from me, they might be more open to coming. That's not your decision to make. I yelled. You had no right. For the first time in our relationship, I started to question whether we were truly compatible. If she couldn't respect my boundaries on something as important as this, what did that say about our future? The next few days were tense. I felt like I didn't even recognize Sarah anymore. She kept apologizing, but her apologies felt hollow. Every time I looked at her, all I could think about was the betrayal. To make matters worse, my parents responded to her email. They didn't say whether they'd attend, but they took the opportunity to remind her, and me, of how ungrateful I'd been for cutting them out of my life. Reading their words brought back all the old feelings of guilt and shame, and I hated Sarah for putting me in that position. By the time the wedding day was approaching, our relationship was hanging by a thread. We were still going through the motions, picking out flowers, finalizing the guest list, but the joy was gone. Every decision felt like a battle, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental between us had changed. I thought I had made myself clear. I thought Sarah understood how important it was for me to keep my parents out of my life and out of our wedding. But as the days went on, it became painfully obvious that she wasn't letting this go. What started as an uncomfortable disagreement was quickly spiraling into something much bigger and much uglier. It started with subtle comments, the kind designed to chip away at my resolve. One evening, as we were reviewing the finalized guest list, Sarah casually said, "You know, I just think it's sad that your parents won't be there. Weddings are supposed to be about family." I didn't respond right away. I had learned from experience that sometimes silence was the best way to avoid escalating an argument. But the silence didn't work this time. "Don't you think it's time to let go of the past?" she pressed, her tone soft but persistent. "I mean, isn't that what therapy is for? Moving on?" I closed my laptop and looked her straight in the eye. "Sarah, this isn't about holding a grudge. It's about protecting myself. Having them there would destroy me. That should have been the end of it." But the next day, she brought it up again, this time during a phone call with her mom. I overheard her say, "Jason's parents aren't coming to the wedding. Can you believe that? It's so heartbreaking." When she hung up, I confronted her. "Why are you telling your mom about this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Because it's upsetting," she snapped. I needed to vent. Venting is one thing, but making me out to be the bad guy isn't fair. She threw her hands up in exasperation. "I'm not making you out to be anything. I just think you're being unreasonable. The tension between us grew thicker by the day. Every conversation seemed to circle back to my parents, no matter how hard I tried to steer it in another direction. One night, after dinner, Sarah brought up a story she'd read online about someone who reconnected with their estranged family at a wedding. It was so beautiful, she said, her voice full of emotion. They hadn't spoken in years, but the wedding brought them back together. That's great for them, I replied. But that's not my story. Why not? She shot back, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Why can't it be your story? You're the one standing in the way of that. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Standing in the way? Sarah, they were toxic. They hurt me in ways you can't even imagine. This isn't some fairy tale where everyone hugs and makes up. Her eyes narrowed. Maybe it could be, if you weren't so stubborn. The argument that followed was one of the worst we'd ever had. Sarah accused me of being closed-minded, of letting my trauma dictate my life. I accused her of being insensitive and refusing to respect my boundaries. By the time it was over, we were both shouting, and I stormed out of the apartment to cool off. When I came back a few hours later, Sarah was sitting on the couch, her face streaked with tears. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I hate seeing you like this. I hate knowing there's this huge part of your life that's unresolved. I'm sorry too, I said, sitting down beside her. But you need to understand that inviting them isn't the solution. It would only make things worse. She nodded, but the look in her eyes told me she still didn't get it. Things escalated even further when Sarah's brother, Eric, got involved. He was staying with us for the weekend, and during dinner, Sarah brought up the issue in front of him. Eric, what do you think? She asked, her voice overly casual. Don't you think it's weird to get married without your parents there? Eric glanced at me, clearly uncomfortable. I guess it depends on the situation. Sarah launched into a detailed explanation of why she thought my parents should be invited, completely ignoring the fact that I was sitting right there. By the time she finished, Eric looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. I don't know, he said awkwardly. It sounds complicated. Exactly, Sarah exclaimed. It's complicated, but it's worth trying to fix. I couldn't take it anymore. Can we not do this in front of your brother? I said sharply. Sarah frowned. Why? It's not like it's a secret. It's not a secret, I snapped, but it's also not up for public debate. That night, after Eric had gone to bed, the argument erupted again. Why are you trying to embarrass me? I demanded. Why can't you just drop it? Because I care about you, she shouted. And I care about your parents. You might not want them in your life, but I do. Her words hit me like a slap. This isn't about you, Sarah. This is about me, and what I need to feel safe. She crossed her arms, her eyes blazing. Maybe you need to stop being so selfish and think about the bigger picture. I stared at her, stunned. Selfish? Do you have any idea how hard this is for me? How much it hurts to even talk about them? Her expression softened, but her stance didn't. I just want what's best for you. And I think reconnecting with your parents could be the first step toward healing. I shook my head. You don't get it. And I'm starting to think you never will. The breaking point came a few days later. Sarah had invited her best friend, Emily, over to help with wedding planning. I came home to find the two of them poring over a seating chart, and to my horror, there were two new names on the list. My parents. What the hell is this? I demanded, pointing at the chart. Sarah looked up, startled. I thought maybe if we made space for them, you might reconsider. I turned to Emily, who looked just as uncomfortable as Eric had. Did you know about this? I asked her. She shook her head quickly. I told her it was a bad idea. Then why are you here? I asked, my voice rising. Jason, calm down, Sarah said, stepping between us. It's not a big deal. We can take them off if you're really against it. Really against it? I repeated, my voice shaking with anger. I've told you 100 times, I don't want them there. How many times do I have to say it before you respect my decision? Sarah and I didn't speak for the rest of the night. I slept on the couch, staring at the ceiling and wondering how we'd gotten to this point. I loved her, but her refusal to listen was tearing us apart. By morning, I knew I couldn't keep going like this. Sarah, I said as she poured herself a cup of coffee. We need to talk. She looked at me, her expression wary. About what? About us. About whether this is going to work if you can't respect my boundaries. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say anything. And for the first time since all of this started, I wondered if love was really enough. 3 months before our wedding, I thought we'd finally put the issue of my parents to rest. After countless arguments and sleepless nights, I believed Sarah had finally accepted my decision to keep them out of my life and out of our wedding. But what I didn't know was that she'd been quietly making plans behind my back, plans that would completely shatter the trust between us. It started like any other day. I was at work, buried in emails and project deadlines, when Sarah called. Her voice was unusually cheerful, a stark contrast to the tension that had dominated our conversations lately. Hey babe, she said. How's your day going? Busy, I replied, glancing at the clock. What's up? Oh, nothing much, she said, her tone light and casual. Just finalizing some wedding stuff. I've been going through the RSVP list. I felt a flicker of unease, but brushed it aside. Anything I need to know? Nope, all good, she said quickly. Too quickly. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but something about that conversation nagged at me. Sarah's cheerfulness felt forced, and her quick dismissal of the RSVP topic left a sour taste in my mouth. Still, I told myself I was overthinking. She'd promised to respect my boundaries. She wouldn't go behind my back, would she? That evening, as I was driving home, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a text from Ethan. Hey man, just got a weird message from your mom. She asked if I'm going to your wedding. I nearly swerved off the road. My heart started pounding as I pulled over to read the message again, hoping I'd misunderstood. But there it was, in black and white, proof that my mom knew about the wedding. I immediately called Ethan. What the hell did she say? I demanded. Relax, man, he said. She just sent a group text asking if I was coming to the wedding. I didn't reply because I figured you didn't want her involved. How does she even know about it? I asked, my voice shaking with anger. Ethan hesitated. I assumed Sarah told her. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I ended the call. I was fuming, but I needed confirmation before confronting Sarah. I dialed her number, and she answered on the second ring. Hey, Jason, she said, her voice still unnaturally chipper. Sarah, I said, trying to keep my tone steady. Did you tell my parents about the wedding? There was a brief pause, just long enough to send my anxiety into overdrive. Why are you asking that? She said, her voice suddenly guarded. Because Ethan just got a text from my mom. I snapped. She asked him if he's coming to the wedding. Care to explain how she knows about it? There was another pause, longer this time. When she finally spoke, her voice was trembling. Okay, look, I didn't want to tell you like this, but yes, I reached out to them. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't even speak. You? What? I finally managed to say. I invited them, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason, I know you're upset, but please just listen to me. Upset? Upset doesn't even begin to cover it, Sarah. I shouted. You went behind my back and invited the people who have caused me nothing but pain. I did it for you, she cried. I thought if they came, maybe you could finally have closure. Maybe you could start to heal. Closure, I said, my voice dripping with disbelief. You think closure comes from inviting them to my wedding, the one place I should feel safe? I just wanted to help, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't mean to hurt you. Well, you did, I said, my voice cold. You betrayed me, Sarah. I hung up the phone and sat there in silence, trying to process what had just happened. The woman I was supposed to marry had gone behind my back and invited the very people I'd spent years trying to escape. It felt like a knife to the heart. When I got home, Sarah was waiting for me in the living room. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she looked like she'd been crying for hours. Jason, please, she said as I walked in. Let's talk about this. There's nothing to talk about, I said, dropping my bag on the floor. You lied to me. You broke my trust. I didn't lie, she said, her voice pleading. I didn't tell you because I knew how you'd react. That's the same thing. I shouted. You knew how important this was to me, and you did it anyway. The argument that followed was one of the worst we'd ever had. Sarah kept insisting that she'd acted out of love, that she'd only wanted to help me heal. But I couldn't see it that way. To me, it felt like a betrayal of the deepest kind. At one point, she said something that made my blood boil. Jason, I think you're being too emotional about this. You need to think about the bigger picture. The bigger picture? I repeated, my voice shaking with rage. The bigger picture is that this is my wedding, my life, and you've completely disregarded my feelings. I didn't disregard your feelings, she said, tears streaming down her face. I thought you'd see that this was the right thing to do. Well, you thought wrong, I said coldly. The days that followed were a blur of anger and heartbreak. I couldn't even look at Sarah without feeling a surge of betrayal. I started sleeping on the couch, unable to share a bed with someone who had so completely disregarded my boundaries. To make matters worse, my parents started calling me. I hadn't spoken to them in over 5 years, but now my phone was lighting up with their numbers. I didn't answer, but the voicemails they left were enough to send me spiraling. Jason, it's your mother, one of them said. I heard about the wedding. I think it's time we put the past behind us. Call me back. The sound of her voice brought back memories I'd spent years trying to forget. The manipulation, the guilt trips, the constant criticism. It all came flooding back. One night, after ignoring their calls for days, I finally snapped. I called Sarah into the living room and handed her my phone. Do you see this? I said, showing her the missed calls and voicemails. This is what you've done. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said, her voice trembling. I just wanted them to be part of your life again. They're not part of my life, Sarah, I said, my voice breaking. And now, thanks to you, they're back in it. When Sarah and I got engaged, I thought I had found my forever. She was kind, intelligent, and fiercely independent. All the qualities I'd ever wanted in a partner. But after everything that had happened with my parents, the cracks in our relationship began to show, and I started to wonder if we were truly compatible. The night after the secret invitation debacle, we had our first real conversation about what had happened. Sarah sat across from me at the dining table, her hands clasped tightly together. She looked nervous, like she was bracing herself for a fight. I wasn't in the mood for fighting, though. I just wanted answers. Why, Sarah? I asked, breaking the silence. Why would you go behind my back like that? She looked down at her hands, twisting her engagement ring around her finger. I told you. I just wanted to help. I thought maybe if they came to the wedding, it could be the start of something better. Better for who? I asked. Because it sure as hell wouldn't be better for me. Her eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean to hurt you, Jason. I really didn't. We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Sarah spoke again. Do you think we can move past this? She asked, her voice trembling. Do you think we can find a way to make this work? I wanted to say yes. I wanted to believe that we could put this behind us and move forward. But deep down, I knew that things would never be the same. I don't know, I admitted. I don't know. The next few days were a blur of tense conversations and forced smiles. We tried to carry on with wedding planning, but the joy was gone. Every decision felt like a chore, and every conversation felt like a ticking time bomb. I could tell Sarah was trying to make things right, but her efforts only made me feel more disconnected. One evening, we went to dinner with her parents, Linda and Robert. They were excited about the wedding and kept asking us about the details, the flowers, the food, the guest list. When Linda asked about my parents, I felt my stomach drop. Are they coming? She asked, her tone casual. I glanced at Sarah, who looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. No, I said firmly. They're not. Linda frowned. Oh, that's such a shame. I really think weddings are a time for family to come together. I forced a tight smile. Not in this case. After dinner, Sarah and I had another heated discussion. Why didn't you tell your parents the truth? I asked. Why didn't you tell them that my parents aren't coming because of what they've done to me? I didn't think it was my place, she said defensively. It's your place to meddle behind my back, but not to stand up for me? I shot back. She looked at me, her eyes filled with hurt. Jason, I'm trying. I really am. But you make it so hard. Maybe it's not supposed to be this hard, I muttered. A week later, we decided to sit down with a couples therapist, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Harper who had a calm, soothing demeanor. I had my doubts about whether therapy could fix what was broken between us, but I was willing to give it a shot. During our first session, Dr. Harper asked us to talk about our values and what we wanted from our relationship. Sarah went first, describing her deep belief in family and the importance of reconciliation. I grew up in a close-knit family, she said. My parents always taught me that family comes first, no matter what. I just want Jason to have that, too. When it was my turn, I told Dr. Harper about my childhood, about the manipulation, the constant criticism, and the years it took for me to rebuild my self-esteem after cutting my parents out of my life. I don't want reconciliation, I said firmly. I want peace. And I can't have that with my parents in my life. Dr. Harper nodded thoughtfully. It sounds like you two have very different views on family, she said. Have you talked about how those differences might impact your future together? That question hung in the air like a cloud. We hadn't talked about it, not really. We'd been so focused on the wedding that we hadn't stopped to consider whether we were truly aligned in our values. And as the weeks went on, it became increasingly clear that we weren't. One night, Sarah and I sat down for yet another conversation about our future. This time, there was no yelling, no accusations. Just two people trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. I love you, Jason, Sarah said, her voice breaking, but I don't know if I can marry someone who doesn't believe in the same things I do. I felt a lump rise in my throat. I love you too, I said, but I don't know if I can marry someone who doesn't respect my boundaries. We decided to postpone the wedding, hoping that more time would help us find a solution. But as the weeks turned into months, it became clear that the damage was too great to repair. Every conversation felt like a rehash of the same argument, and every attempt at reconciliation only pushed us further apart. One day, I came home to find Sarah packing her things. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with sadness. I think we need to take a break, she said. I need some time to figure out what I want. I nodded, unable to speak. I watched as she carried her suitcase out the door, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alone. In the weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I replayed our arguments over and over in my head, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. But deep down, I knew the truth. We were never going to work. Our views on family were fundamentally incompatible, and no amount of love could bridge that gap. Breaking up with Sarah was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it was also a turning point, a chance to start fresh and build a life that truly reflected my values. And while the pain of losing her is still fresh, I know I made the right decision.